The Federal marches were not rapid, and it was not until near noon that Pope himself arrived at Manassas and found that Jackson had mysteriously vanished. He was utterly at a loss to guess where he had gone. His first supposition was that he had gone toward Leesburg, and he ordered McDowell to move to Gum Springs in pursuit. He soon countermanded that order, and hearing of Hill's having been at Centreville and of the cavalry attack upon Burke's Station, he ordered a general concentration of his troops at Centreville. This was his last order for that day, and all was now quiet for some hours. Jackson and his 3 divisions lay hidden in the woods within 7 miles of the ruins of Manassas until 5 p.m. At that hour, King's division of McDowell's corps, 4 brigades about 10,000 strong with 4 batteries, appeared upon the Warrenton Pike in front of Jackson's ambush, marching towards Centreville in pursuance of Pope's order. King had been marching from Gainesville to Manassas, and Pope's orders had intercepted the march and changed its direction. Jackson, about a mile from the road, might have remained hidden and allowed King to pass. Had he known that at that moment Lee and Longstreet were still beyond Thoroughfare Gap, and that Ricketts's division of McDowell's corps was at the gap, one might suppose that he would hesitate to disclose himself. But if Pope was allowed to withdraw behind Bull Run, the result of the whole campaign would be merely to force Pope into an impregnable position. It was the fear of this which led Jackson to attack King immediately, even though he knew that it would draw upon him Pope's whole force. Leaving Hill's division in position on his left, holding the road to Aldie by which he might retreat in case of emergency, Jackson formed a double line of battle, with Taliaferro's division on the right and Ewell's on the left. Taliaferro, W.B., had in his front line from left to right the old Stonewall Brigade, now under Baylor, and that of A.B. Taliaferro, and in rear the brigade of Stark. His 4th Brigade under Bradley Johnson was detached and in observation near Groveton. Ewell had in his front line Lawton's and Trimble's brigades, and in his 2nd Early's and Forno's, in all about 8,000 infantry. Orders were sent for 20 pieces of artillery, but owing to difficulties of the ground, only 2 small batteries arrived in time to be engaged. These were isolated and could not be maintained against the superior metal of the enemy. King's division, not dreaming of the proximity of the enemy, was marching down the pike with only a small advanced guard and a few skirmishers in front. The brigades were in the following order: Hatch's, Gibbon's, Doubleday's, Patrick's. The action which now ensued was somewhat remarkable in several features. It was fought principally by the brigadiers on each side. McDowell, in command of the Federal Corps, was absent, having gone to find Pope and have a personal conference. The division commander, King, was absent, sick at Gainesville, only about 2 miles off. Ewell and Taliaferro, W.B., the 2 Confederate major generals, were both seriously wounded, Ewell losing his leg. Probably, for these reasons, less than a half of either force was brought into the brunt of the action. When this had developed itself, Jackson ordered Ewell's 2nd line, Early and Forno, to turn the enemy's right flank. In the darkness, they were unable to make their way in time through the woods and across the deep cuts and high hills of an unfinished railroad, stretching from near Sudley's Ford toward Gainesville. The fighting, meanwhile, had ceased. The notable part of this action was fought by Gibbon's brigade of 3 Wisconsin regiments and 1 Indiana reinforced by 2 regiments of Doubleday's, the 56th Pay and the 76th N.Y., in all about 3,000 men. Opposed was Taliaferro's front line of 2 brigades, A.G. Taliaferro's on the right, and the Stonewall Brigade, now only about 600 strong under Baylor, on the left, with some help also from Ewell's front line of Lawton's brigade and Trimble's. These troops were all veteran infantry, and it is to be noted that the decidedly smaller force of the Federals had never before been seriously engaged. They had indeed the great aid and support of 2 excellent batteries, but their desperate infantry fight, attested by their losses, illustrates the high state of efficiency to which troops may be brought solely by drill and discipline. It may be a sort of mechanical valour which is imparted by long-trained obedience to military commands, but it has its advantages. even though there may be appreciable differences in it from the more personal courage inspired by a loved cause. A good idea of this contest is given in the official report of General W.B. Taliaferro. At this time our lines were advanced from the woods in which they had been concealed to the open field. The troops moved forward with splendid gallantry and in most perfect order. Twice our lines were advanced until we had reached a farmhouse and orchard on the right of our line, and were within 80 yards of a greatly superior force of the enemy. Here one of the most terrific conflicts that can be conceived of occurred. Our troops held the farmhouse and one edge of the orchard, while the enemy held the orchard and the enclosure next to the turnpike. To our left there was no cover, and our men stood in the open field without cover of any kind. The enemy, although reinforced, never once attempted to advance upon our position, but withstood with great determination the terrible fire which our lines poured upon them. For 2 hours and a half, without an instant's cessation of the most deadly discharges of musketry, round shot and shell, both lines stood unmoved, neither advancing and neither broken or yielding, until at last, about 9 o'clock at night, the enemy slowly and sullenly fell back and yielded the field to our victorious troops. Separate returns for this action were made only for Lawton's and Trimble's brigades. Only partial statements for the other commands are found in the few official reports. Of many commands there are no reports, owing to the number of commanding officers who were killed or disabled in succeeding battles. The returns of Lawton's and Trimble's brigades are as follows. The Stonewall Brigade, out of its small force of 600 muskets, lost 3 colonels, 2 majors, and over 200 men, killed and wounded. Taliaferro's brigade lost a lieutenant colonel and 2 majors. Its other casualties were probably about 100. Gibbon's brigade, out of 2,300 men, lost about 750, and Doubleday's 2 regiments, about 800 strong, lost about 350. Hatch's brigade, from the front, and Patrick's from the rear, were not engaged, partly because of the length to which the marching column had been strung out upon the march, and partly perhaps because of the absence of General King. But he came upon hearing of the action, and at 1 a.m. on the 29th, by his order, the division was put in motion for Manassas Junction. He thought himself in the presence of superior forces, and decided that it was best to get nearer to reinforcements. It is now time to return to Lee and Longstreet, who bivouacked between White Plains and Thoroughfare Gap rather early in the afternoon of the 27th. Scouts sent ahead by Longstreet reported the gap clear, and messages were received from Jackson that he was in ambush upon the Warrenton Road. To make sure of the passage through Thoroughfare Gap, D.R. Jones's division was sent forward to occupy it. The gap is a narrow pass, only 80 yards in width, bounded on the north by basaltic cliffs over 200 feet in height, and on the south by steep hills, rocky and covered with vines and undergrowth. A small force in possession could hold the pass against any front attack. As Jones's column drew near the gap, officers riding ahead discovered the approach of a large Federal force. It was Rickett's division, sent by McDowell upon his own responsibility, to prevent the advance of reinforcements to Jackson. It was a move which, quickly made and strongly backed, might have brought victory to the Federals. Jones deployed the 9th Gay of Anderson's brigade and sent them through the gap. They met and drove back the Federal pickets until, meeting heavier forces with artillery, they were themselves driven into the gap, where the whole brigade formed, and essayed to scale the mountain on the left. This was only possible at a few places, but the 1st Gay succeeded and got into a good position, and repulsed with loss an attack by the enemy, who came so near that some were killed by pistol fire of the officers. Meanwhile, Benning, commanding Toombs's brigade, was ordered to occupy the mountain on the right of the pass. He started off at the double quick, through a hot fire of artillery, and after a stiff climb occupied the crest just in time to repulse the enemy advancing upon it from the other side. Sharp skirmishing took place until dark. Jones's division had no artillery, and it could only oppose the enemy's by selecting men armed with rifled muskets and sending them as skirmishers to pick off the cannoneers and horses. Yet this was done so successfully that the enemy's batteries were often compelled to move, and Ricketts speaks of his total losses as severe. Jones's total casualties were about 25. One great disadvantage, under which the whole Confederate army was still labouring at this period, was that most of its arms were the old caliber 69, smooth-bore musket, using the round ball with effective range of only about 200 yards. When Benning collected from 2 regiments all rifled muskets, he got only about 30 from the 20th Gay, and 10 or 12 from the 2d Gay. When the enemy's heavy fire of artillery disclosed his force in front of the gap, Longstreet at once took measures to turn the position. Hood, with his 2 brigades, was ordered to cross the mountain by a cattle trail a short distance to the north, and Wilcox's division of 3 brigades was ordered to force a passage, if necessary, through Hopewell Gap 3 miles to the north. Both of these flank movements were accomplished during the night, but Ricketts had decided not to wait. He had been so discouraged by his reception that he scarcely waited until nightfall to start back to Gainesville. And at daylight next morning, having learned that King's division had fallen back to Manassas, Ricketts took the road to Bristow. The departure of the enemy from their front at dark on the 27th was observed by the Confederates, and on the morning of the 28th the remainder of Jones's division marched through the gap, and was joined by Hood and Wilcox from their respective routes by the Cattle Trail and Hopewell Gap. By noon, Lee and Longstreet had arrived at Gainesville and connected with Jackson, and the second great step in Lee's strategy had been successfully accomplished. The third and last also, by that time, was in a fair way of accomplishment, for Pope, instead of concentrating his forces behind Bull Run, had taken the offensive, and had already begun his attack upon Jackson. Of that action it is now to tell. Jackson's whereabouts had been disclosed to Pope by the attack upon King's division, but Pope failed to note that Jackson was the aggressor. He supposed that King had intercepted Jackson in an effort to escape through Thoroughfare Gap. His available forces, on the morning of the 29th, were as follows. On Bull Run, 2 miles east of Jackson, were Sigel's corps, 3 divisions, and Milroy's independent brigade, together about 11,000 strong, and Reynolds's division of Pierre. Reserves, about 8,000, with 14 batteries. At Centerville, 7 miles to the northeast, were the 3 divisions of Hooker, Kearny, and Reno, about 18,000. About 7 miles to the southeast at Manassas, and between there and Bristow were the corps of McDowell and Porter, about 27,000, in all about 64,000. Jackson's forces, now about 18,000 infantry, with 40 guns, were formed along the unfinished railroad line, which stretched south from Sudley's Ford to the Warrenton Pike, about 3 miles. Of this, the 2 miles nearest Sudley were held in force, the rest by skirmishers, except that the right flank on the Warrenton Pike was held by Early's and Fornow's brigades of Ewell's division. The left of the line was held by A.P. Hill's strong division of 6 brigades. In front of the extreme left was wide, open ground for a half-mile. Then came about a mile of wood from 200 to 600 yards wide, and then again the open, rolling fields. Hill's division was formed in 3 lines of battle, with 16 guns to command the open ground in his front. Ewell's division, now under Lawton, held the centre, with the brigades of Lawton and Trimble in 2 lines. Taliaferro's division, now commanded by Stark, held the right, formed in 3 lines of battle, with 24 guns massed to fire over the open ground in front. Pope was not obliged to fight, certainly not to take the offensive. He might have withdrawn across Bull Run and awaited the arrival, within 2 or 3 days, of Sumner's and Franklin's corps and Cox's division. If he did fight, he would have stood a fair chance of success had he first massed his army and concentrated its power in united effort, with reserves to follow up every success. But he was sure to lose if he allowed his divisions to fight in piecemeal. As Jackson was forming his lines at sunrise, Sigel's and Reynolds's columns were visible, nearly 2 miles away, deploying for the attack. Sigel held the right with 3 divisions, supported by Milroy's brigade. Reynolds held the left. The enemy's line was not parallel to Jackson's, their right being nearest to Jackson's left, and their left somewhat retired. About 7 o'clock the enemy's batteries were brought forward and opened fire. Their skirmishers were advanced, and the lines of battle followed. On the right and the left of Groveton Wood, the wood in front of Jackson's left centre, the Confederate batteries, having fair play, held back the enemy's advance. Opposite the wood the enemy encountered only skirmish fire, and they easily entered. But when they approached the Confederate line of battle and met its fire, the conflict was short and the Federals retreated, Gregg's brigade following them. Milroy's brigade came to their help, but Thomas's brigade came to Gregg's, and the Federals were driven completely through the wood and pursued by the Confederate fire as they retreated across the fields. This much was over by 10:30 a.m. The best of Pope's opportunity would be lost by 1 p.m., for by that hour Longstreet's troops would be on hand. But now Reno and Kearny, from Centreville, were beginning to come upon the field, and Sigel, calling upon Reno for reinforcements, again made a desperate assault, which reached the Confederate line in such strength as to necessitate the calling up of Branch's brigade from Hill's third line. With this brigade the wood was again cleared, and Sigel's divisions were practically put hors du combat. It was now about noon, and Pope, who had been at Centreville, not realizing the size of the affair near Groveton, arrived upon the field. He immediately organized a fresh attack with the 3 divisions of Kearny, Hooker, and Reno. Had he awaited their arrival before wreaking Sigel in vain efforts, his chances would have been better. These 3 divisions made their assault about 1 o'clock. As before, the division on the extreme right, Kearny's, was held off by the 16 guns firing over the open ground on Jackson's left. The other 2 divisions came through the wood, and this time portions of the assaulting column actually crossed the railroad line, and fierce hand-to-hand fighting ensued, the brunt of it falling upon Field's and Thomas's brigades. Field was severely wounded, but Pender's brigade, from Hill's third line, joining in the melee, the Federals were again borne back and again pursued, not only through the wood, but out into the open ground beyond, where Pender incautiously followed. Here he met a hot fire and fell back to the woods. On seeing his retreat, Grover's brigade of Hooker's division, being in reserve, was sent forward for a counterstroke. Advancing slowly through the wood, it gave a volley and then rushed the somewhat disorganized Confederate line and carried a considerable space. Had they had prompt and ample support, victory was within their grasp. By this time, Longstreet's troops had connected with Jackson's extreme right, relieving the brigades of Early and Forno. These had been brought from their isolated position on the right flank and placed in the rear of the centre. Jackson had seen Grover's advance and now sent Forno's Louisianians and a regiment of Lawton's Georgians to the onset. Johnson's and Stark's brigades were also brought to fire upon Grover's left flank. So, caught in the whirlwind of fire which burst upon him in the high tide of his success, Grover was swept back across the line and out of the wood, and driven beyond the Warrenton pike, with a loss of 1/4 of his command. 4 determined assaults had now been made through the Groveton wood, and each had met with a bloody repulse. At least 4,000 Federals had fallen in them. Not one attack had had any chance of success, for each had been made with too few men, but the continuous fighting from 7 a.m. until 4 p.m. had also thinned the Confederate lines and had greatly reduced the ammunition supply of many of the brigades. There was now a lull in the battle for a while, during which many Confederates collected cartridges from the bodies of the fallen. On the right and left of the Groveton wood the fighting had been largely of artillery or musketry at long range, and there had been no actual collisions. Pope had been very sanguine in the morning that he was about to bag Jackson, and he was now unwilling to give up the effort, while the sun was still high above the horizon, and while he still had comparatively fresh troops. Kearny's 3 brigades opposite the open ground on Hill's left had had no close fighting, and Reno's 2 brigades were also in good condition. Besides these, he looked for help from Porter's corps, and from King's and Ricketts's divisions of McDowell's corps. Ricketts could have been with him, but for his blunder in the morning when he took the road to Bristow on learning that King had fallen back to Manassas. Thus, Jackson's attack upon King had produced the effect of keeping 2 divisions out of the next day's fight. As to Porter, there is much interesting history which can only be briefly summarized here. Porter, in the 7 days, had proved himself not only a hard fighter, but a skillful commander. He would have made a good leader of an army, but he had a low opinion of Pope, and, in his correspondence with brother officers about this period, did not conceal it. It so happened that, under Pope's orders, Porter's corps had that morning marched from Bristow by Manassas for Gainesville. Now, at 4:30 p.m., supposing Porter in position at Gainesville, Pope sent him peremptory orders to immediately attack Jackson's right flank. But Porter was not at Gainesville. When, about 11:30 a.m., he reached a little stream called Dawkins Branch, about 3½ miles short of Gainesville, he found Confederate cavalry in his front. He deployed a brigade in line of battle, and, advancing a strong skirmish line, captured some of Longstreet's scouts. Meanwhile, clouds of dust, extending back 10 miles to Thoroughfare Gap, indicated that a large force was arriving at Gainesville. Stuart, to notify Jackson of his approach, had made some cavalry drag brush in the roads. Nevertheless, Porter prepared to force his way. He deployed his corps of 2 divisions in 2 lines and advanced a brigade across the stream. King's division, which was marching in rear of Porter, closed up, but remained in column. About this time McDowell came upon the field and remonstrated with Porter, saying, "You are too far out. This is no place to fight a battle." As McDowell ranked Porter when their troops were together, McDowell was in command. Just before meeting Porter, he had learned that at 8:45 that morning, 17 regiments of Confederate infantry and a battery had passed, marching down the Warrenton Road toward Groveton. After some reconnaissance, McDowell decided to leave Porter where he was, and to take King back to a road by which he could reach the left flank of Reynolds's division, now engaged with Jackson's right. Ricketts's division, returning from its march to Bristow, was now following King, but both divisions were exhausted by from 12 to 18 hours' marchings. When McDowell left, with King and Ricketts, Porter considered himself too weak to venture an attack upon the Confederates in his front. His force was only between 9,000 and 10,000. He had no reinforcements at hand, and he had in his front Longstreet's corps of nearly 25,000. His course was proper, and his threatening position practically neutralized an equal number of the Confederates, for D.R. Jones's division of 3 brigades, and Wilcox's of 3, were each deployed and held in observation of Porter all the afternoon. Pope, having sent his order to Porter to attack at 4:30, waited a half-hour to allow time for the message to reach Porter, and at 5 ordered Kearny and Reno with their 5 brigades to attack Jackson's left. To finish with Porter first, the 4:30 order did not reach him until about 6:30. He at once ordered his leading division, Morell's, to advance, but before the necessary arrangements could be made, darkness had come on, and he was compelled to abandon the idea of attacking. For this, and some other minor incidents, Pope, soon after the battle, preferred charges against Porter, at right angles, to oppose a front to Porter's corps, and Wilcox's 3 brigades were held in reserve behind Jones. Now that his army was again united, Lee was inclined to engage at once, but Longstreet asked to be allowed first to make a personal reconnaissance. After making one, occupying an hour, he reported adversely on account of the easy approach open on his right to large Federal forces reported to be at Manassas. Lee was not satisfied with this report, and recurred to the idea of attacking down the turnpike. It was now so late in the afternoon, however, that Longstreet suggested making only a reconnaissance in force, reserving the attack until dawn next morning, and to this Lee agreed. Accordingly, Hood's and Evans's brigades were ordered to advance for the reconnaissance, and Wilcox's division was withdrawn from the rear of Jones as a support to the movement. Thus it happened that when King's division advanced, expecting to find Jackson in retreat, it met Longstreet advancing. The fight which ensued was prolonged until 9 p.m. It was fierce and bloody, but the first half-hour of it converted King's advance into a retreat. He was pursued until he found refuge in the heavy lines holding the high ground about Pope's centre, with the loss of a gun, several flags, and some prisoners. Longstreet then withdrew his attacking brigades back to the ground from which they had advanced. It had happened also that, although Jackson had been entirely successful on the left, his victorious troops, being withdrawn from the pursuit, had not halted at the railroad cut, their line during the day, but had been carried back to a line a short distance in rear, selected by Jackson. Thus, on both flanks, the Federals, although defeated, were left during the night with deserted battlefields in their front. They discovered the fact before midnight, and this discovery proved to Pope a fatal delusion and a snare. Had it been a deliberate ruse, it would have been a masterpiece. Pope thought it could have but one meaning, that the Confederates were retreating toward Thoroughfare Gap. At daybreak he had wired Halleck as follows: "We fought a terrific battle here yesterday with combined forces of the enemy, which lasted with continuous firing from daylight until dark, by which time the enemy was driven from the field which we now occupy. The enemy is still in our front, but badly used up. We lost not less than 8,000 killed and wounded, but from the appearance of the field, the enemy lost at least 2-1. The news has just reached me from the front that the enemy is retreating toward the mountains." Pope clearly believed this story on the insufficient evidence before him, and this error made him the aggressor next morning and cost him the battle, as we shall see. The object of the Confederate advance on the afternoon of the 29th, as we have seen, was a reconnaissance preparatory to an attack at dawn, which Longstreet had suggested as better than one so late in the afternoon. Hood and Evans had been charged to examine the enemy's positions carefully, and to report as to the feasibility of the morning attack. About midnight reports were brought by each, adverse to making it. Upon these reports, Lee decided to stand his ground for the day and see if the enemy would attack. If he did not, Lee proposed to inaugurate a fresh turning movement around Pope's right during the night of the 30th. His force upon the field, including 2,500 cavalry, was now nearly 50,000. Jackson, reduced by casualties, had about 17,000. Longstreet had, with R.H. Anderson, about 30,000. Pope, at last, had united his whole army, except Banks's corps. It had hardly recovered from its so-called victory at Cedar Mountain, and was in charge of the wagon trains about Bristow. Before daylight, orders had been sent withdrawing Porter from his isolated position on the extreme left and bringing him around to the centre, and now Pope, believing his victory already half won, had massed, almost under his own eye, about 65,000 men and 28 batteries. 2 corps, Sumner's and Franklin's, of the Army of the Potomac, and 2 extra divisions, Cox's and Sturgis's, in all about 42,000, were coming from Alexandria, 25 miles off, as fast as possible. With these, Pope would have about 107,000 in the field. Lee also had some reinforcements coming, and already at the Rappahannock River. They were the divisions of McLaws and D.H. Hill, each about 7,000, Walker's division about 4,000, Hampton's cavalry 1,500, and Pendleton's reserve artillery 1,000, total 20,500. Having telegraphed Halleck that the Confederates were retreating, Pope now began to set his army in battle array to press the retreat. Some hours were consumed, but they were well spent in forming his troops, thus avoiding the isolated efforts of the previous day, and arranging for a simultaneous attack along the whole line. Meanwhile, there was some artillery firing at rather long range by each side, and skirmishers in front were everywhere in easy range and sharply engaged. The Federal line was short and strong. From its right on, Bull Run in front of Jackson's left, to its left across the Warrenton Pike, near Groveton, was less than 3 miles. Within this space were deployed about 20,000 infantry in the front line, and behind it 40,000 more were held in masses to be thrown where needed. Lee's line covered at least 4 miles. Jackson, on the left, had proved the strength of his unfinished railroad as a defensive line of battle and had no wish to change. But, with his instinctive desire to mystify his opponent, he had withdrawn his men into the nearest woods and hollows, where he kept them carefully out of sight. He had had but one reinforcement from Longstreet's corps, a battalion of 18 guns under Col. S.D. Lee, which early that morning had taken position on his right flank, where it could support the fire of the large battery near his centre. Longstreet's line, as before said, was not a prolongation of Jackson's, but bent to the front, the two forming a rather flat crescent, its right flank overlapping Pope's left considerably. The Federal Army made a finer display than was often seen on a battlefield in the war, being closely concentrated upon ground unusually open, and Pope, from one of the hills close in rear of the centre, viewed it with pride and confidence. Of his opponents he could see little but a few batteries, supported by little more than skirmishers, and he so firmly believed that Jackson was already retreating that he would not be convinced by those of his officers who had had evidence of large forces near at hand, behind the Confederate skirmish lines. A Federal who had been captured and held a prisoner in the Confederate lines during the night, but who had escaped, reported that he had overheard Jackson's men say that they were going to join Longstreet. Porter had sent the man to Pope with a message discrediting the story and suggesting that he might have been deceived or sent as a ruse. Reynolds, on the left, had discovered that the Confederate line overlapped the Federal and had had a narrow escape from capture. Ricketts had fought Longstreet at Thoroughfare Gap on the 28th and retreated before his advance, but the tale of the escaped prisoner was credited in preference to any other theory. About noon, a swarm of skirmishers advanced along the whole Federal front and were followed by the Federal line of battle, arrayed generally, 3 lines deep in front. The Confederate artillery wasted but little fire on the skirmishers. When, however, the triple lines of battle revealed themselves, there happened something for which Pope was not prepared. Not only did every Confederate gun open a rapid fire, but above their roar could be heard the infantry bugles of Jackson's corps, and from the woods a wave of bayonets swept down to the unfinished railroad, and now Jackson and Longstreet were united, and Pope, with a force only 30% superior, was committed to the attack. Possibly the Confederates may have flattered themselves that their victories in the 6 assaults made on the previous day would have diminished the ardour of the coming attack, but if so, they were to be disappointed. The value of discipline and training was again illustrated, and the battle which followed was scarcely surpassed for desperation upon either side in the war. The whole weight of the assault fell upon Jackson's corps. His men defended themselves with courage and the confidence inspired by their recent successes. When, at one point of the line, the ammunition ran low, men laid down muskets and, standing on the railroad embankment, made formidable missiles of an abundant outcrop of large pebbles. At length, Pope's superior force produced such a pressure that Jackson called for assistance, and Lee ordered Longstreet to send a division of infantry. But Longstreet had discovered that the left flank of the attack upon Jackson had now advanced into the re-entrant angle between his front and Jackson's, so far that its lines of battle now presented their flanks and could be enfiladed. He believed that he could most quickly relieve Jackson by a severe enfilade fire of artillery. Several batteries of artillery were rushed into a suitable position and opened upon the enemy's flank at easy range a raking fire, which nothing could withstand. Within 15 minutes the aspect of the field was changed. When Pope had first seen Jackson's corps disclose itself and reoccupy its defensive line along the unfinished railroad, he had very injudiciously withdrawn Reynolds's division from his extreme left and placed it in support of Porter's corps, although Milroy's corps, from among his masses in reserve, was equally available. In vain now were Reynolds and all his other reinforcements advanced to stem the tide of retreat across the open meadows under the Confederate fire. Porter's triple lines had been practically merged into one as the successive brigades came to the support of those in front. The merged forces were still pressing forward and in close proximity to the Confederate line when the flanking fire of the artillery opened and quickly disorganized the attack, Jackson added to the confusion by advancing 2 brigades in a counterstroke, and Pope's battle was lost. Unfortunately for Lee, Pope had not opened his battle early enough in the day to allow time for the Confederates to win a victory and to reap its full fruits. It was now about 4 p.m. when Lee, seeing the effects of Longstreet's fire, ordered his whole force to be advanced for a counterstroke. Had the Confederate army been a well-organized force, able to bring quickly into play its full powers, much fruit might even yet have been gathered. The objective point aimed at by Longstreet's advance was the plateau of the celebrated Henry House, upon which Jackson's brigade, standing like a stone wall, had made his name immortal 13 months before. Around this plateau, the regulars and others of the best Federal troops, both of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, now made desperate stands, appreciating that its possession by the Confederates would cut off the Federal retreat across Bull Run via the Pike and the Stone Bridge. Their stand was also aided by 2 circumstances. First, Jackson's division, now greatly worn and reduced by their incessant fighting for 3 days, and having more exposed ground to advance over, were not able to push the enemy's retreat as rapidly in the counterstroke as Longstreet could upon the right. Consequently, Pope was able to bring over some reinforcements to his left flank from his right, and his artillery was able to take in flank those of Longstreet's forces which led the assault upon the Henry Hill. Secondly, 3 of Longstreet's brigades were lost from his attack from looseness of organization. Wilcox's, Pryor's, and Featherstone's brigades had been called a division, and Wilcox ordered to command them as such. In the progress of the fighting during the afternoon, Pryor's and Featherstone's brigades had become separated from Wilcox's, just when it was called for by Longstreet, and carried to assist the attack upon the Henry Hill. The other 2 took some part upon the right flank of Jackson, but the weight of the division as a whole was lost. Drayton's brigade of D.R. Jones's division, also without orders, was taken by some unauthorized person to oppose a rumoured advance of cavalry upon our right flank. The rumour proved to be unfounded, but the brigade was kept out of the action until the fighting was terminated by darkness. Daylight was shortened by heavy clouds, and a rain which set in about dusk and continued during the night and much of the next day. Although the firing was kept up quite severely for some time after dark, the attack was practically over as soon as daylight was gone. For the irregular and disconnected lines, though with ample spirit and force to carry the position, had time permitted them to envelop it, were paralysed by the danger of firing into each other in the darkness. In the Federal army the confusion was very great, as troops and trains intermixed, groped through the rain, and poured across the bridge and along the pike towards Centreville. There Franklin's corps had arrived about 6 p.m., only a few hours too late to have come upon the field and have saved the day. Upon this corps Pope ordered his whole army to concentrate. An officer of the regular army, Captain W.H. Powell, describing this night march, wrote in the Century War Book as follows. As we neared the bridge, we came upon confusion. Men, singly and in detachments, were mingled with sutlers' wagons, artillery caissons, supply wagons and ambulances, each striving to get ahead of the other. Vehicles rushed through organised bodies and broke the column into fragments. Little detachments gathered by the roadside after crossing the bridge, crying out the numbers of their regiments as a guide to scattered comrades. And what a night it was! Dark, gloomy, and beclouded by the volumes of smoke which had risen from the battlefield. Had Longstreet pushed rifled guns to the front, upon the turnpike, and fired at high elevations down its straight course, he might have landed shells in this retreating column as far as the Stone Bridge. This would probably have blocked the column and added much to the captured property. But the Confederates as yet had no artillery organisation which could quickly appreciate and improve all the passing opportunities of a battlefield. Indeed, as before stated, the army was only a mass of divisions, associated by temporary assignments to Longstreet and Jackson, who were themselves only division commanders. On the morning of the 31st, Lee lost no time in renewing his advance. As the position at Centreville was strong, and had been fortified by the Confederates in 1861, he ordered Jackson's corps to turn Centreville, crossing Bull Run at Sudley, and moving by the Little River Turnpike upon Fairfax C.H. Stuart's cavalry were to precede Jackson. Longstreet was to glean the battlefield and then to follow Jackson. All progress was slow on account of the rain and mud. This was the third battle within 14 months, which had been closely followed by heavy rain. Bull Run, Malvern Hill, and Second Manassas. The theory took root that cannonading has rain-making virtue. On the 31st, Jackson, over wretched roads and through continued rain, advanced only about 10 miles and bivouacked at Pleasant Valley on the Little River Pike. Longstreet's advance reached Sudley Ford, and the care of the battlefield was left to the reinforcements from Richmond, which were now coming up. On September 1, the march was resumed by Jackson at an early hour, and Longstreet followed over the same road. Pope, in a dispatch to Halleck during the night, had reported his falling back to Centreville, but had still claimed a victory, saying, "The enemy is badly whipped, and we shall do well enough. Do not be uneasy. We will hold our own here." Yet he had left 30 guns and 2,000 wounded on the battlefield, and had ordered Banks at Bristow Station, in charge of his trains, to destroy all supplies and to come to join him at Centreville, with his troops, by a night march. With Franklin's, Banks's, and Sumner's corps, which arrived early on the 31st, he had now 30,000 fresh men, but his delay at Centreville was limited to a single day. That evening the presence of Stuart's cavalry, shelling his trains near Fairfax C.H., became known, and next morning reports reached him of Jackson's corps on the Little River Turnpike. Finding his position again turned, Centreville was abandoned, and a new one ordered to be taken at Fairfax C.H. This move practically placed him beyond pursuit. His whole army was now united and too close to its fortified lines to be again flanked out of position. And, although there was demoralization in some organizations, yet there were many excellent division and brigade commanders, leading veteran troops so well trained and disciplined that their fighting was of the highest type. An illustration of this took place late in the afternoon of the 1st. Jackson's corps, approaching the junction of the Little River and Warrenton pikes, had formed line of battle at Ox Hill, with A.P. Hill's division upon the right. 2 of Hill's brigades, under Branch and Brockenbrough, were sent forward to develop the enemy, who were known to be near. A terrific thunderstorm, with strong wind and blinding rain directly in their faces, came on just as this advance was being made. With this storm on their backs, Stevens's division of Reno's corps, the 9th, charged the approaching Confederates in front and flank, and drove them back in much confusion. The division making the charge had been engaged on both the 29th and 30th, and had been defeated on both days. Its fine behaviour and hard fighting was the feature which makes this engagement notable. It was, under the circumstances, a useless affair. There was little chance of either side accomplishing any result beyond the killing of a few opponents, with probably equal loss to itself. Hill sent strong reinforcements to restore his battle, and Kearny's division of the 3D Corps came to Stevens's assistance. Stevens was shot through the head. Kearny, riding into the Confederate lines in the dusk, was also shot dead, as he tried to escape capture by wheeling his horse and dashing off, leaning behind his horse's neck. The fighting on both sides was desperate and bloody, but the Federals were driven back. During the night, the whole Federal army was withdrawn from the vicinity of Fairfax, and took refuge within the fortified lines about Alexandria. Stevens and Kearny were both prominent and distinguished officers. The advantage to the Confederates of their being taken off, like the cashiering of Fitzjohn Porter, was among the few fruits of their victory. Indeed, at the moment when Stevens fell, bearing the colours of a regiment which he had taken from the hands of a dying colour-bearer, the authorities in Washington were about to supersede Pope and place Stevens in command of the now united armies of Pope and McClellan. He had graduated at the head of Halleck's class at West Point in 1839, and Halleck was well acquainted with his military attainments. Both Stevens and Kearny were favourites in the old army, had served most creditably in Mexico, and both had been severely wounded in the capture of the city, Kearny losing his lee arm. Kearny's body fell into the hands of the Confederates, and being recognized, it had been sent the next day, under a flag of truce, by Lee into the Federal lines with a note to Pope saying, "The body of General Philip Kearny was brought from the field last night, and he was reported dead. I send it forward under a flag of truce, thinking the possession of his remains may be a consolation to his family." This affair ended the battle. On the morning of Septus 2, it was apparent that the enemy had escaped, and Lee allowed his whole army to be in camp and have a little much-needed rest. While he had fallen short of destroying his greatly superior adversaries, he could yet look back with pride upon the record he had made within the 90 days since taking command on June 1st. He had had the use of about 85,000 men, and the enemy had had the use in all of fully 200,000. At the beginning, the enemy had been within 6 miles of Richmond. He was now driven within the fortifications of Washington, with a loss in the 2 campaigns of about 33,000 men, 82 guns, and 58,000 small arms. Lee's own losses had been about 31,000 men and 2 guns. The critics who had declared that he would never fight were forever silenced and pilloried in shame. In the last affair at Ox Hill on September 1, the casualties in A.P. Hill's corps were 39 killed and 267 wounded, and in Ewell's were 44 killed and 156 wounded, a total of 83 killed and 423 wounded, 506 total. There were no reports in the Federal Army of this particular affair, but probably the losses were not very unequal. The losses of the 2 armies for the whole campaign are summarized as follows. No report was made of casualties in the Confederate cavalry, which were probably about 100. 30 guns and over 20,000 small arms were collected from the field. My own share in this campaign was limited to keeping up the supply of the ammunition consumed. I had the satisfaction of seeing the organisation and working of my department stand well the test of a severe campaign and a considerable separation from its depots. Both in the artillery and infantry, the fighting was incessant and severe, but the supply of ammunition never failed, and at the close of the campaign, without a day's delay, the army was prepared to undertake an even more distant and desperate adventure. When Lee moved from Gordonsville to cross the Rapidan, I was ordered to follow with my reserve ordnance train from near Richmond. I followed as rapidly as possible, but could not overtake the army until after Chantilly. Then I replenished all expenditures, so that the troops advanced into Maryland with everything full. Hereafter I kept myself and train in close proximity to Lee's headquarters in all the movements, and with my wagons running between our successive positions and Staunton, VAR, we were able to meet all demands. Chapter 12. Boonesborough or South Mountain and Harper's Ferry. The enemy having taken refuge within lines impregnable to assault, Lee had no alternative but to take the offensive elsewhere. He could not afford to sit down before Washington and await the enemy's pleasure. There were 2 openings for offensive operations, each with some chances of success. The safest would have been to withdraw behind the Rappahannock, where he might occupy a strong line with 1/2 of his forces under Jackson, while the other half, under himself and Longstreet, was sent by railroad to Chattanooga via Bristol. At the time, in Tennessee, the Confederates were conducting 2 campaigns aimed at Louisville, the design being to drive the Federals from Kentucky. Kirby Smith, with an army of about 15,000 from Knoxville, had opened the road through Cumberland Gap, and on August 30 had won a victory over a Federal force at Richmond Kai, and on September 2 had occupied Lexington. Bragg, with about 30,000 men from Chattanooga, had moved northward up the Sequatchie Valley, and crossing the Cumberland Mountains was, on September 5, at Sparta 10, turning the Federal position at Murfreesboro, where Buell was in command with about 50,000 men. Such a movement by Lee would have been utilizing our interior lines, the one game in which the Confederacy had an advantage over the Federals. On a small scale, it had been played both at Bull Run and in the Richmond campaign, the troops from the valley in both cases leaving the Federal armies opposite them and quickly doubling on the point of attack. Opportunities to do the same upon a larger scale were repeatedly offered between the Confederate armies before Richmond and those about Chattanooga. One had already occurred in the summer just past. On May 30th, Beauregard had evacuated Corinth with 52,000 men and withdrawn to Tupelo, Miss. He was not followed, and the Federal Army under Halleck of 100,000 was dispersed in different directions from Arkansas to Cumberland Gap. Beauregard was allowed 2 months of idleness and rest. It would have been possible to bring 20,000 of his veterans to Richmond by the 26th of June to reinforce Lee for the 7 days campaign. With their assistance, McClellan should have been destroyed. Then the Western troops could have returned, and, if necessary, carried large reinforcements with them. Now a second opportunity was offered for similar strategy. Others were offered later, as we shall see, whenever one of the Confederate armies, from any cause, was free from the prospect of an early attack by its opponent. On this occasion, the joint campaign of Bragg and Smith in Kentucky and the Maryland campaign both failed. Had we utilized our interior lines, one of them at the least should have been made sure. It was hoped, indeed, when the campaigns were entered upon, that the southern sympathies of the Marylanders and Kentuckians would cut real figures in the struggle by bringing thousands of recruits to the Confederates, but this hope proved vain in both cases. There had been already enough observation of the war to destroy its romance, and to make the most careless realize what a grave step one would take who shouldered a musket under the Starry Cross. Many sympathized with our cause and wished us well, but few were willing to abandon homes and take sides before we had shown ourselves able to remain in their states for at least a few weeks. And this, in the case of Maryland, was utterly out of the question for the simple reason that there was no railroad communication possible, and no army large enough to meet the Federal Army could support and supply itself by wagon trains from Staunton, nearly 150 miles away, for any length of time. Whenever, therefore, we crossed the Potomac going northward, we were as certain to have to recross it coming southward in a few weeks, as a stone thrown upward is certain to come down. In a letter to President Davis on Sept. 2, Lee gave as reasons for the invasion of Maryland that it would relieve the Confederacy from the presence of hostile armies on her soil, and that the position of the army would be favorable for reaping the fruits of a victory, if one could be gained. Mr. Davis approved, and the campaign was made, but no victory was gained, nor is it easy to see where and how the chances of pursuit would have been improved had it been. Apparently Kentucky might have offered more favourable ones. After a rest of a day, on Sept. 4, with Jackson in the lead, the army was put in motion for the fords of the Potomac near Leesburg. With the reinforcements which had joined, Lee had now about 55,000 men, all in fine spirits and with their cartridge boxes full, but otherwise not in the best condition. The different divisions were still only associated, not formed into corps, and in the matter of shoes, clothing, and food the army was, upon the whole, probably worse off during this brief campaign than it had ever been before, or ever was again. About one half of the small arms were still the old smooth-bore muskets of short range, and our rifled cannon ammunition was always inferior in quality. The lack of shoes was deplorable, and barefooted men with bleeding feet were no uncommon sight. Of clothing, our supply was so poor that it seemed no wonder the Marylanders held aloof from our shabby ranks. For rations we were indebted mostly to the fields of roasting ears and to the apple orchards. Such diet does not compare with bacon and hardtack for long marches, and, before the campaign was over, the straggling from all causes assumed great proportions. Brigades were often reduced nearly to the size of regiments, and regiments to the size of companies. On Sept. 5, the army began to cross the Potomac, and on Sept. 7, the advance reached Frederick. It is now to tell of events in Washington City. There was great alarm when Pope, with the combined armies of Virginia and the Potomac, fell back within the fortifications, almost in a state of rout. Colonel Kelton of Halleck's staff, sent to find out the actual state of affairs, reported that there were 30,000 stragglers upon the roads. It was said that the money from the Treasury was being shipped to New York, and that an armed naval vessel, with steam up, was kept near at hand in the Potomac. Pope, making a virtue of necessity, applied to be relieved from command. There was no formal order relieving him until September 5, when he was sent to the northwest, where there were some Indian disturbances, but he was deprived of his army on September 2, when McClellan was assigned to the defence of Washington and the command of all the troops engaged in it. As this included the whole of both armies, Pope was left without a man. Yet neither Lincoln nor Halleck had confidence in McClellan, and there was great reluctance to use him. Only the day before he had been instructed that he had nothing to do with the troops engaged in active operations under General Pope, but that his command was limited to the immediate garrison of Washington. At that time, Pope himself had already been adjudged incompetent, and the decision would surely have been made to place Stevens in command had he been alive. But the death of Stevens and the disorderly retreat of Pope's forces within the fortifications had demoralized the government. McClellan alone was supposed to have the confidence of the army. It was the day of his triumph, and one of humiliation to both Lincoln and Halleck. Yet McClellan was out of place. He would have been an excellent chief of staff, but was unfit for the command of an army. He was as utterly without audacity as Lee was full of it. His one fine quality was his ability to organize and discipline. He constructed a superb machine, which, being once constructed, would fight a battle with skill and courage if only let alone. McClellan, during the 7 days, let it alone, absenting himself as if by instinct. Never but at the Battle of Sharpsburg was he present on any field, and his presence, by keeping Porter's corps out of the action, made a drawn fight of what would otherwise have been a Federal victory, as will duly appear. So now, September 2, while Lee's army is resting on the field of Ox Hill, McClellan begins to reorganize the 120,000 troops at his disposal within the lines of Washington. It is quick and easy work, for his own old army composes 2/3 of it. By September 7, when Lee's army is concentrated about Frederick, McClellan had 6 corps in the field, holding a line covering Washington. Lee, perhaps unfortunately, was not then seeking an action. He had issued a proclamation to the people of Maryland, and for a few days he wished to observe its effect. It told the Marylanders, briefly, that the liberty of free choice between the Union and the Confederacy had been denied them by the United States, and that he had come to assist them in regaining their rights and would respect their decision. It took but a short while to show that very few had any interest in the matter. When our troops forded the Potomac, the bands playing Maryland, My Maryland, there was great enthusiasm, but it was confined to the invaders. The invaded were conspicuously absent, attending to their daily occupations, and evidently not ambitious to offer their fertile and prosperous fields for the movements and conflicts of armies. I think the only real effect of that proclamation was subjective, or upon Jenon Lee himself. Necessarily, in it, he was compelled to appear as a deliverer who had come to free the Marylanders from a yoke. A few days later, as will be seen, there was an opportunity for him to avoid a great risk of grave disaster by withdrawal into Virginia, without serious loss of men or impairment of prestige, and with richer booty and prisoners, guns and ammunition than he had ever gathered from a battlefield. In his decision to stand his ground and fight, his attitude as deliverer probably had a large share. The organization and strength of the two armies is given on pages 226 and 227. As before noted, the Confederate organization into corps was slowly developing. What is here given is what was reached at the close of the campaign. In its earlier stages, there was much independence of action by some divisions. This independent communication with headquarters, it will presently be seen, resulted in a mishap, the loss of an order of prime importance to the issues of the campaign. It is but an illustration of how gravest results hang on care in most trifling details. It was Lee's plan to draw the Federal army away from Washington before delivering battle. To do this, he contemplated an advance into Pennsylvania west of the Blue Ridge. This plan was frustrated by the Federal forces at Harper's Ferry and Martinsburg, continuing to hold their positions after Lee had crossed into Maryland. As they were exposed to capture, he had expected them to withdraw. McClellan had desired to withdraw them, but Halleck objected that there was then no way by which Miles could withdraw. McClellan then suggested that Miles should cross the river and occupy Maryland Heights, where he could defend himself, but the suggestion was not adopted by Miles, who felt himself obliged by his orders to hold the village itself. As Lee could not advance freely into Pennsylvania with Miles's force so close in his rear, he determined to capture the Harper's Ferry garrison. Discussing the matter with Longstreet, the latter advised against it, saying that it would require a wide separation of our divisions, with rivers between them, which would be dangerous so near the enemy. Lee, however, believed that it was possible to capture Harper's Ferry and reunite his army before McClellan could fully apprehend his plans.